That's enough of all of the announcements. Now we have to get to the real program, which is Professor Steve Niva from the Evergreen State College. Many of you already know Steve, and we're glad to have you back again. Steve has been a faculty at Evergreen for at least 20 some odd years, 25 years, and has taught a lot of different programs. But before that, and I think also during the last 25 years, you've worked and taught in the Middle East and worked with Syrian refugees in Denmark and in Syria and Turkey also. You were not in Syria, but worked with Syrian refugees. So thank you, Steve, for being here. And so let's give Steve a warm welcome. Thank you. And we'll hold questions to the end. We'll hold questions to the end. Thank you.
Let me just check on volume. Are we good? Okay. And I'll try and keep it close to my mouth. That sometimes we lose it. And I'm going to stand here in the middle, even though I think we're weighted over here a little bit, but I can move around, and we'll have access to our, it doesn't work. There we go. It works. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Nina. Thank you, OWAC. And thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate you all being here. I know a lot of you over the years, and there's some people I don't know, and then some former students of mine as well over here. So glad to have you all here. Obviously, the last couple years, our attention has been largely focused on the Israel-Gaza war and the spillover regarding that conflict. So, and of course, now with the new Trump administration, it's also easy to get distracted on other issues. Gaza will apparently be our new 51st state, the new Riviera in the Middle East. But that's not going to happen. But we could talk about that later. But nevertheless, I think it may be hard to miss actually something really historic that just happened in December. And that is the fall of the Assad regime, the Assad family regime in Syria. It's really momentous. It's hard to state this just as someone who's a Middle East studies specialist, lived in the region, spent so much of my life there. It's hard to imagine that the Assad regime is gone. It's a big deal. When I was going to graduate school, one of the first books we read, I was studying international relations in the Middle East. And one of the first books we read is Patrick Seal's great book called The Struggle for Syria, and how so much in the Middle East revolves around Syria. And Syria is often the object of struggle between those in the Middle East and those outside the Middle East. So it's a big deal. To catch us up on just what happened, and then I'm going to give a broader analysis and sort of bring you into the story, and then hopefully we'll have some good discussion. To make sure everybody knows what just happened, I'm gonna be a little closer to this screen, but you can see it over there. Oh, you know what? I can do it with my. Oh, I could even do it here too. All right, good. So what happened in early December? Just the short version of the story. What happened was here is Idlib. Right here, this is a province, a small province in northern Syria called Idlib. And in Idlib was the last remaining rebels, the Syrian rebels from 2011. I'm going to talk more about this. And in December, they must have been planning for this for years. They broke out, captured Aleppo, and kept on going down south. This is the main highway through Syria that heads to Damascus. And they kept on going. And the Iranians and the Russians basically dropped Assad. They just decided, time's up, we're out of here. And they did not stop this group. The organization was called, it's in Arabic, it's called Hayat Tahrir Asham, which in English means roughly Organizations of the Liberation of Syria, of Greater Syria, actually. And we're going to talk a little bit more about who that organization is, obviously. But that's what happened. And as you can see, move ahead. They basically completed the liberation of most of Syria from the Assad regime. And this is the new leader. His name, he used to call himself Mohammed Jolani, but his real name is Ahmed el-Shara'a. So I'll be saying that Ahmed el-Shara'a is his real name. And that is now, he's now the interim president, and his group, HTS, Hayat Tahrir Hashem, is now kind of merged into the government with a number of other organizations. So we'll get to that at the end. So is everybody with me so far? That's what happened. The rebel group basically took over Syria, drove Assad out. He flew to Moscow. I think there's a cul-de-sac somewhere outside of the Kremlin for former dictator allies. They live in there, and I think they kick the ball between in the cul-de-sac. There's one in Saudi Arabia too, actually, for a lot of ex-African dictators and Middle Eastern dictators. Okay, so that's where we are with our story. Let me go. I'm going to talk about 3 different storylines of where this came from, the fall of the Assad regime and this new rebel movement and so on. And they're going to be, the first one's going to be the Arab Spring. The second storyline is going to be the Syrian refugee crisis. And the third storyline is going to be the war on terror, especially the invasion of Iraq. Now that may surprise you, but you'll see why I'm going to mention this. Because the fall of the Assad regime comes from those 3 storylines in particular, okay? So let's start with the first one, the Arab Spring. You all remember back in 2011, I know a lot of you probably remember when we had the uprisings in the Arab world. This was the slogan of the uprisings. In Arabic, it's called, they would chant, Ashab, the people, Uskat, Yurid, want, Uskat Nizam, the downfall of the regime. That was the slogan of the revolution. The people want the fall of the regime. See it there. And it all started in Tunisia. I don't know if you remember this, the fishmonger, Mohamed Bouazizi, finally had enough of the corruption and the bribery and the police harassment and the poverty and the lack of any future and the fact that Tunisia was run by a 30-year-long kleptocratic dictator whose wife controlled her family controlled half the economy. He controlled the other side of it. I mean, Tunisia had become just a hideous place if you wanted to have a flourishing life. And of course, that was mirrored in a number of other countries in the region, in Libya or in Egypt and elsewhere. And so we had these uprisings that took place. I have to do it over here, I think. Uh-oh. All right.
I can do it.
You think you can do it? Doesn't it only work over here?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's right. You're right. I'll have to go over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
We were looking good so far. Yeah, it's not working. And if not, I'm totally fine without images and I can do it. Oh, there we go. Alhamdulillah. All right. Okay, cool. So we had the Arab Spring broke out, started in Tunisia. Of course, many of the protesters are narrating it for us, right? First Tunisia, second Egypt, third Libya. And we had these popular uprisings. And I would say in many ways, they targeted what we in Middle East states, we call them mukhabarat states. Mukhabarat just means police states, right? The mukhabarat is the name for the internal police security system. Let's see. Yeah, it still doesn't work, so you'll have to do it. Other way. There we go. And so the story, as you remember, was Tunisia was first, then Libya, then Egypt, and in all cases, the dictator was overthrown, whether it was Ben Ali or Gaddafi or Mubarak, right? And then it was to Yemen, it went. In Yemen, there was a big popular uprising, democratic uprising in Yemen. And then surprisingly, in Bahrain, a very rich country, but also one with a real serious social cleavage and a fairly repressive dictatorship, also in Bahrain. And the question was, what was next? And what was next was, please move on, was Syria, right? And in Syria, some kids had been scrawling Shabiri, Duskata Nizam. They were scrawling all these slogans that they've been hearing and reading about, and they were picked up by the Mukhabarat in Syria, the internal police, and they were tortured and murdered. And suddenly that sparked an uprising throughout Syria. So to put it into our story of what's happened now, in many ways, what we're seeing is the finalization of the Arab Spring in Syria through a long piece of history. And what happened was, actually, could you go back? Yeah, great. Where we are is that in almost all the cases now of Arab uprisings, we have had regression. In fact, there's no success story right now. Tunisia, back to dictatorship. Egypt, back to dictatorship. Libya, torn apart in a civil war. Yemen, civil war, brutal outside Saudi aggression for a while that we played a role in, unfortunately. Bahrain, back to repression. So in many ways, what's happened to the Arab Spring is the people lost. They demanded the downfall of the regime, but unfortunately, there's been a counter-revolution largely led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They're sort of the leaders of the counter-revolution. They have very deep pockets, and they're able to fund, to pick winners and losers, and they've played a really major role. Qatar's played a little bit of role, Turkey's played some role, but basically, in all cases of uprisings, you've seen a return to repression or kind of chaos and civil war. In the case of Syria, what we saw was the Syrian regime was much stronger than Tunisian regime, than Libyan regime, than the Egyptian regime. And in part the reason why is not because it was any less repressive, but it was nor corrupt, but a significant part, the minority population in Syria is from a particular community called the Alawite community. If you're familiar with the Islamic religious tradition, you've probably heard of Sunni and Shia. Sunni being the kind of majority of Muslims are Sunni, majority of Arab states are Sunni. They practice the Sunni faith of Islam. And then the minority or the smaller groups are Shia, like Iran is mostly Shia, southern Iraq is mostly Shia, southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah was, they're Shia, right? So, and the Alawites are sort of related to the Shia. And they are in Syria, and it's from them that the Assad family comes. So they were promoted to the top of the pyramid, actually by the French, if you go back to colonialism. And so they had a lot to lose if the regime went down, and they were willing to fight very hard. Whereas once the regime was going down in Egypt or Tunisia, nobody cared. That was a really thin basis of support. You see what I'm saying? They were so kind of corrupt and distant from society. So Syria was able to last longer. Secondly, at a certain point in the uprisings, the popular uprisings, actually go ahead now. See, it's so hard now that I'm not controlling it. Go ahead. Next, there we go. So here we have Bashar Assad, the young son. His father actually created this whole dynasty. Of course, there's one of the Makhlouf, the totally corrupt family in Syria that are cousins of Assad with their Lamborghinis. Meanwhile, people are suffering and serious situation. Go to the next slide. And of course, this was another one of the slogans. This in Arabic is irhal, which means out. And you could add swear words with that if you wanted. Keep going, next. And of course here, I always love this. You see this? You see what's going on here? These are shoes. This is one of the most common sort of symbols of disgust and anger and just contempt is if you like put the shoe out. It's just a real tradition in the Arab world because the shoe is seen to step on, right? And it symbolizes that. I don't know if you remember this. A couple years into the Iraq war, do you remember when an Iraqi journalist threw a shoe at President Bush? That's where that comes from, okay? I mean, it doesn't come from there, but that's what we're talking about, right? I was in Egypt once, sitting in this like very way out of the way cafe once, and I had my feet up, like crossed my legs and my feet were up, and some guy just came and just hit my foot down, and I got the message. You're not showing your feet, it's not what you're doing. But anyway, that's just a little side note. But obviously, big uprising against Assad. Next slide. And before long, Syria was in a civil war. All these were areas where there was rebel activity, okay? And that basically, this is desert, that's desert. So This is the Tigris River, and I mean the Euphrates River. Tigris is going up here. And then this is more the fertile hinterland and mountains and so on. The Alawite community is largely from here. That's where Assad regime comes from. Let me just see. Latakia would be the capital, Latakia and Tartus in that area. And that's their stronghold. So the Alawite community and some of the close regime kind of keeping them together. The rebellion got really strong. Next slide. And then what happened was Syria became a proxy war. On the Syrian side, you had Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah came in and decided to prop them up, that this was going to be key for them. And on the other side, you saw a motley assortment. Honestly, it was really a lot of Gulf folks, like from Saudi, and it wasn't necessarily government either. It could have been security services. It was really messy. And then the Americans got involved as well, funding certain so-called moderate rebels and others. And they got involved. And then basically weapons started flooding into Syria, and a really brutal civil war broke out. What I would add here is that the reason that the Syrian regime survived was because at a certain point, the Russians and the Iranians said, this is existential for us, because this is Russia's major naval and air force bases, particularly naval bases. And the Iranians, for them, it was the pipeline to Hezbollah, which is their sort of, they call it forward defense with Israel. It's their deterrence against Israel, the way they see it. So they kept this regime in power, and particularly by providing air power so that the regime could bomb the rebels and prevent the rebels from having any air power. And what the regime ended up doing, I don't know if this is my next slide, could you do it? Oh yeah, that's just a little like regional map in a sense. That was sort of the proxy war that happens in Syria. Go next. There, this is what I wanted to get at. The Assad regime didn't really have the manpower, but it had the air power. And so the way it fought the war was largely to destroy urban populations where the uprising was taking place. And so in sort of military terms, or new terms that we've been talking about, I've written about this a little bit and talked about it, they were engaged in what we call herbicide. Their strategy was to destroy urban areas in order to remove the population from a space that they could defend themselves from the regime. And so just imagine if you keep on destroying urban area after urban area after urban area, where are the people going to go? Well, of course, you're going to depopulate your country. And that actually became the strategy of the Syrian regime, which sounds kind of crazy, right? You're trying to keep yourself in power and so on. The way you're going to keep yourself in power is basically by killing and driving out your population so you can stay in power. And in fact, there was a slogan that partisans of the regime used, which was, in English, it is Assad or we burn the country. In Arabic, I think it's Assad أو نحرق البلد. And that's basically what they did. That was their strategy. It's like, we're going to stay in power, and if there's no country outside of our palace, etc., we're fine with that. And this was the strategy they followed. Next slide. Nevertheless, at the end of the war, there's a few complications, but we'll skip them. By the end of the war, here is the Idlib area, which was all that was remaining of the rebel population. They got sort of driven in. This is because of the Iranian and the Russian intervention. And there was a Kurdish uprising as well, where they created a little independent zone. So that's in the yellow. That's the Kurdish. They created an autonomous zone and actually had this really kind of wild, quasi-feminist, quasi-anarchist sort of form of governance structure. It's really interesting, by the way. And they kind of created an autonomous zone. The Turks started to get involved. The Turkish army was running a rebel group as well. And then kind of the remnants of the original rebels end up here in Idlib. Okay, so do you see how we've walked back to the start? That's where they came to overthrow the Assad regime. Okay? Okay, next slide, please. That's the first story. So in many ways, what happened right now is 14 years later, the Arab Spring has finally made its way and overthrown the regime. Okay. The second storyline is the Syrian refugee crisis. And here the storyline is that I think we're in the final chapter of the Syrian refugee crisis. As I said, the Assad regime stayed in power in part because it came up with a strategy to depopulate the country of people opposed to it. So the people it was driving out were people who could potentially oppose the regime. And it did it quite effectively. Next slide. That's the Yarmouk camp. It's largely a Palestinian camp inside Damascus. Just devastating. I mean, you can't even, it's astonishing. Keep going. All right. So you ended up with a country of, let's say, about 25 million. 14 million of the 25 million are displaced during the fight. Just think about it. It's astonishing. And of that, 6 million to 7 million, probably 7 million, are displaced out of the country. The others are displaced within the country, IDP, internally displaced people. The others are technically now refugees, right? A refugee is someone who crosses the border because of a forced reason and then tries to seek asylum or shelter or the UN system. And most of the rebels, most of the refugees end up in Turkey, or they end up in Lebanon or Jordan, some in Iraq, some in Egypt. And that's largely where they went after the initial round of fighting by about 2015, let's say, okay? And I want to be really fair here to Turkey. They actually really stepped up. They actually had red carpet refugee treatment, and I'm not kidding, and I'm not a fan of the Erdogan regime, but they really stepped up. They put a lot of resources into managing a massive refugee crisis. Story is going to change in a bit, but I want to give them credit. Meanwhile, Lebanon, basket case, basically 1 in 4 people in Lebanon, 1 in 5 people in Lebanon are Syrian refugees. And Jordan, very difficult situation. It's higher than that. It's probably closer to 1 million. Okay, so we have the refugee crisis. Next slide. And for a number of years, people were living in tents and encampments and so on. Some of the world's newest cities are Syrian refugee cities in northern Jordan, for example. And there was a thought that perhaps at some point they could go back, that the Assad regime would fall or something would happen and they can go back. But once the Russians and the Iranians got involved big time in Syria, they realized the game was over. They weren't going back, because going back to Syria would mean you would immediately be targeted by the regime, you'd be recruited into the military, or set to Sednaya prison, which is probably was one of the worst prisons for torture and abuse in the world. So people weren't going back. Plus the country was destroyed. So once that happened, what do you think many of the refugees decided to do? They decided it's time to leave the camps. And that's what we often call the Syrian refugee crisis. Apparently it wasn't a crisis until over 1 million of them start to head towards Europe. And then we have the Syrian refugee crisis. Next slide. So basically they start going to Europe. And it ends up being about 1.2 million Syrians, but it also attracts Iraqis, Afghanis, people fleeing Eritrea in Africa, and a number of other places also join this exodus. But the core of it's Syrian. And they start trying to get into the EU. Next slide. And you remember these scenes, crossing the Greek islands, for example, heading out of Turkey, leaving the camps in Turkey and crossing. Next slide. Yeah, and then making their way up through the corridor. And many of them were aiming to get to Germany because that's where they felt like they could find employment and work and so on. And you have to understand, many of these Syrians, these are highly skilled, highly educated people. Syria is a very sophisticated country, highly educated. Lots of skills and talents, and they wanted to go places where they could possibly find employment to be able to pay for their families who were still in the camps, right? Because this is and this is what you see in refugee trends all around the world. It's not that they're, quote unquote, they're not sending their best. Actually, they are sending their best, and actually they're sending themselves. It's often those with the most chances for aptitude and success that are coming. Next slide. And I don't know if you remember this, but there was a famous moment where Angela Merkel, the former president, I think, chancellor of Germany, basically said, yeah, we're big and we're strong and we'll manage. And it was quite something because she's not known as a liberal progressive. She's kind of standard bearer centrist social conservative. But she did that, and it was a huge move. And that allowed them to drop their citizenship requirements and so on to allow the bulk of these refugees to be absorbed into Europe. Next slide. Germany took the most. Sweden took a lot. And then it was spread throughout. And as you can see, still Turkey still had a huge number of refugees. Next slide. However, this is in many ways how the Syrian crisis changed the world. In response to this, admittedly large influx, however, I think Merkel was right. If you look kind of objectively, Europe's birth rate is declining. They were having a problem with low-skilled labor. They were having a number of issues. It's not like this wasn't kind of a match. At the same time, there are cultural transition issues. Those are no doubt real. And of course, you have a traumatized population. That's a real issue. There are real issues. I don't want to minimize those, but European Union could handle that. I'm just saying. However, it did spark a big backlash. And suddenly, this is what fed into the rise of what we think of as right-wing anti-migrant populism. And next slide. That's the basically the Brexit campaign in Europe, in England. Do you remember the let's get out of the EU, we want a Brexit? That was one of their main posters, which is basically a group of mostly Syrians crossing into Greece. And you can see what it is, right? Leave the European Union. Do you see that? And so you can see that the Syrian issues suddenly became mobilized by them. And again, I want to say largely economically, it wasn't a problem, but no doubt there were some issues. I don't want to whitewash that, yet nevertheless, most people's estimate was within a few years, you were going to work this out. Next slide. And of course, we saw the coming to power of Wilders in Holland, Marine Le Pen in France, and people like Perry in the AfD in Germany, these far-right, largely anti-immigrant driven parties. And so the backlash was really strong. Next. And in many ways, this is maybe unfair to Merkel, but you get the point though. Europe basically put a halt on any more refugee movement, and they cut a deal with Erdogan and Turkey. They said, we will pay you billions per year if you prevent the flow from Turkey into the EU. Then they started to pay Libyan mercenaries to prevent the flow into the EU. They started to make deals with the Moroccans to prevent the flow and so on and so forth, right? This is sort of the Fortress Europe strategy. And even people who once had been supported, it's just politics, folks. They were playing politics, they were fearing the far right, and so they make a deal with Erdogan. So in some sense, Erdogan in Turkey, he has a new interest, and I was in Turkey last summer, before this summer, and I have a former student from Evergreen, actually, who's an urban journalist in Istanbul, Turkey, and he's an amazing guy. Perfect fluent Turkish. It's amazing. He came with me on a trip, I want to say in mid-2000s, and lucky for me, I have a place to stay whenever I go to Turkey. And I had an arrangement. There's a Seattle-based group that called Karam House, which actually has this amazing kind of let's call it a creative makerspace, where it's Syrians here, architects and design people, and they have these two houses, one in Istanbul and one in south, near the Syrian border. And they work with kids, and they provide them all these resources for advancement in college. And I went and worked with those guys for a while and did a lot with them. But what I found out at the time was that red carpet treatment in Turkey was over. was suddenly the population was turning because Turkey had a serious economic crisis. It was not the refugees' fault. Again, if you look objectively at the numbers and whatever, that was not the source of this. This was about balance of payments. This was about inflation. This was about Erdogan's crazy idea that somehow you can cut interest rates and you'll never have inflation, which is insane. And but the Syrians were starting to be the brunt, and they were talking in Turkey then, the brunt of antagonism, and they were talking in Turkey, it's time to get rid of them, it's time to go. So where I'm leading you to is the other through line leading us to this recent overthrow of Assad regime. Guess which country is the strongest supporter of the rebel group, enabled them militarily, financially, and otherwise to end up overthrowing the Assad regime? Turkey. Turkey's the big player here. And I think a lot of it's related to the last chapter of the refugee crisis. For Erdogan, it's time to get rid of them. It's time to send them back. Also, for Erdogan, this is what a great market. You know, Turkey has economic potential. Suddenly now this can be their market that they actually can recover from their economic distress by kind of controlling this new market, and also politically, it can give them power. So I think in some ways, that's the second part of the story. All right, let's get to the last part of the story, which is the fun one. Next slide. Okay, who is Ahmed el-Sharaa? Right? This is a wild story, you guys. Ahmed el-Sharaa, Ahmed el-Sharaa. Next slide. You have to go back to the invasion of Iraq to understand where this guy comes from. He's a Syrian. He was born in Saudi Arabia. He apparently very good student, precocious, but then they grew up in Damascus. His family is from the Golan Heights, which is on the border with Israel. Actually, Israel occupies a key part of the Golan Heights and has actually recently put more troops in across on the Syrian side of the border, doing their thing. And so he adopted the name Mohammed el-Jolani. Jolan is the Golan Heights, Jolani. And when the United States started threatening to invade Iraq after 9/11, the Assad regime, who are very devious is a nice way of putting it, canny, basically they had always arrested their more Islamically oriented opponents. That was the main, because they were this sectarian Alawite regime. And who they didn't like was they didn't like sort of Muslim Brotherhood or conservative Islamic, you know, religious political parties. And they would just arrest them, torture, and so on, and hold them. Well, they basically released most of their Islamic prisoners. Or when I say Islamic, I don't mean that they're just Muslim. I mean that they're Islamist. Their politics are shaped by their religious activism. They released them and said, go to Iraq. The Americans are coming. It's a big story. They created a whole pipeline. And Jolani was one of those guys. And he ends up going to, I'm going to call him Jolani until he becomes Ahmed Sharaa. He ends up going to Iraq. Next slide. You remember the fall of Baghdad? Now, not to make any parallels to the present, but I don't know if you remember the way in which the occupation of Iraq happened, but it was about regime change. It was about basically undermining the entire administrative state. It was about dismantling all the agencies of government. Okay, I'm not making any parallels to today. Don't read into anything I'm saying. It's not like we're witnessing the invasion, occupation, regime change of Iraq. Couldn't be. But what happened was a huge vacuum was created in Iraq, right, because of these policies. We call it, those of us who kind of studied this, we call it the year zero strategy. They were trying to basically, the Bush-Cheney administration was trying to, and Rumsfeld put him in here, and Wolfowitz, if you remember all these guys. They basically wanted to erase Iraq and rebuild it, right? And so they created this massive vacuum, and that's the main reason for the failure of the whole Iraq invasion was that there was no phase 4 plan. There was no plan of rebuilding. It was basically about destruction. Again, not making any parallels to today. And it was mainly about tearing things down. And so what happened was remember the reason why allegedly we invaded Iraq was weapons of mass destruction, which, as we know now, were never found because they didn't exist because they'd already been destroyed. And secondly, that Iraq was in league with Al-Qaeda, right? Which was even more tenuous. Because Al-Qaeda and Islamic jihadi activism wasn't in Iraq. But after our invasion and the techniques and the strategy of the invasion of basically creating a year zero strategy, Iraq became the hub of Islamic jihadi activism around the world. Everybody came. It was the place to go. It became the factory of Al-Qaeda terrorism. That's the great irony when you look back. I could really detail this for you, but next slide. And so I don't know if you remember this guy, Zarqawi. He's basically the Al-Qaeda franchise that comes after the American invasion, and he's linked to bin Laden at the time. And so this guy, Ahmed al-Shara, the current leader of Syria, he was this young kid funneled into Iraq from Syria, and he's looking around to join some jihadist party to fight the imperialists. And apparently he was really angry about Israel, the Second Intifada. If you read his story, he was upset about that as well. He ends up kind of joining in with Zarqawi's crowd, this Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Next slide. This is what a quote from a recent interview that was done with him. You know, I worked with multiple factions until I ended up in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And actually, I believe him. He's a really smart guy, by the way. I believe him in this, you know, I don't believe everything he says, but I believe this. Because there were so many different factions. And so he joined up with Al-Qaeda in Iraq because this is why he came. This was the idea. Keep going, next slide. And then we get to the West Point of Islamic jihadi activism in the Middle East. And that was all the guys who the US captured during the Iraq War were all put into Camp Chopper or Camp Bucca, and there was at least 2 or 3 other camps, but Camp Bucca became the main area where all these captured radical Islamic jihadis who were connected to Al-Qaeda or other groups all ended up. And what did they do there? They planned, strategized, they studied. Jolani apparently was very gifted with Arabic, and so he taught classical Arabic so that, you know, in the Islamic tradition, to read the Quran, it's in a very distinctive classical Arabic. It's like reading Shakespearean, you know, English. And he was very good at that. He's a really smart guy. And so he was teaching classical Arabic. And he became seen as distinguished, right? Because suddenly here's this guy with this gift for Arabic. He can read the Quran beautifully. You can imagine the social capital he got. And he'd fought, so he had credibility. And so he gets in with some of the other jihadis. Next slide. And it turns out he gets in with this guy. Now, I don't know if you remember this picture. This is a guy who called himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder and the leader of ISIS. ISIS is created in Camp Bucca. No American invasion of Iraq, no ISIS. I stand by that thesis. ISIS is created in Camp Bucca, where you put all this quote unquote talent together, and Baghdadi creates it, and he's very fond of Jolani, okay? Because he sees his talents and skills. He also knows he's Syrian, which is an asset. Baghdadi, whose name is something like Ahmed al-Badri, you know, this is his nom de guerre, right? His war name. Baghdadi, next slide, says to Jolani, the Syrians have just risen up against Assad, and they hate Assad because he's a anti-Islamic, secular Alawite. Why don't you go over there and join the revolution and bring our brand over there, our extremely conservative, they call it Salafist, is the type of Islam that these guys practice. It's really extreme. You find versions of it in Saudi Arabia. They call it Wahhabi. It's a form of Salafism. This is the very socially conservative, women who are wearing a full niqab, for example, men who are growing their beards out and are only using this one kind of comb because the Prophet Muhammad in 632 used this one kind of comb. Salafist means, in Arabic, it means the Salaf or the ancestors. It means you've got to do what Prophet Muhammad and his close friends did back in the 7th century. That's what we aspire to. So these were Salafists, but they were also jihadists, meaning we should use weapons and revolutionary means to overthrow all the non-truly Islamic regimes in the Middle East and fight the Americans as well, and Israel to boot, if we could. Okay, so these guys are Salaf, and this is Al Qaeda's brand, right? But ISIS, of course, goes even further than Al Qaeda. Next slide. So, so Baghdadi says, I'll take Iraq. You go over to Syria, join the rebels, but push our brand, push our model, and get going. And it turned out Jolani is really good at this. So I always think of like a cartel. Imagine sort of, El Chapo telling, one of his lieutenants, why don't you go over to the Gulf side and set up the cartel over there, right? And then they become the Zetas or something. Think of that analogy. So Jolani comes over and he founds a group called the Nusra Front. And these guys are really effective and they're getting a lot of weapons. Still puzzling to me exactly how they did, but I think they had a lot of support in the Gulf. I don't know where, but he's very effective. He knows how to organize. He knows how to get troops working. He knows how to make alliances with other rebel groups, even those who aren't maybe have the same beliefs as ISIS does. And he doesn't go open as ISIS. So he's very effective with his force, and Nusra Front suddenly is able to fight the Assad regime quite effectively, and they're actually making coalitions with other groups. Next slide. Baghdadi hears about that, and he says, no, you're not doing it the right way. Come back to us. We're actually going to create ISIS, not just Islamic State of Iraq, but Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And again, in Arabic, it's Shem, which means the greater Syria. We're going to actually create the whole thing. So you are no longer independent in Syria. You come under our banner. Are you guys with me? You see the idea? Like Chapo taking the group back and saying, no, you're back in Sinaloa. And so Baghdadi says, I'm taking over. And actually, you know what? I don't care about Al Qaeda anymore. Those guys they're not up to the snuff. We're our own organization. We're going to set up the caliphate, the Islamic Empire, right here, right now. Al Qaeda be damned. We hate bin Laden now. We're in charge now. This is ISIS, right? And what does Jolani do? Next slide. So yeah, and then ISIS starts expanding. Jolani says, no, this is never going to work in Syria. And plus, I'm no longer with you. I'm independent. And basically, ISIS goes to war with Nusra. So imagine this. Jolani and Nusra breaks with ISIS, and he's enemy number one now. Baghdadi and all his people. And remember, they were capturing hostages and, slitting throats on just the most brutal and horrific kind of acts. That's what they wanted to do to Jolani. Next slide. So that's the story. That's where he comes from, okay? He breaks with ISIS, and then he's so effective, he ends up leading the rebels in what remains of their territory, and that's this area right here, Idlib. So do you see how we're coming back to the story now, right, of where the rebel army launched from to take over? So we're back here. The Kurds have created their own autonomy, but it is true, 1,000 American troops are over here, in part because they were watching the pipeline between Iran and Lebanon. The US had its own particular reasons, but they were kind of maintaining a presence here, because the Kurds were the best fighters against ISIS. The Kurds had women fighter units that were apparently extremely effective against ISIS. The Kurds in Syria were quite something. Just want to say that. And they didn't want the Turks to basically destroy the Kurds. So there still are 1,000 US troops there. We wonder what Trump is going to do with them. But nevertheless, basically the Syrian rebel army that's left is in Idlib. Next slide. And there's Jolani now, still calling himself Jolani, Mohammed al-Jolani. And he basically sets up an administration in Idlib, and he starts to transition into being a government. They're no longer a rebel army. It's a government. They had a whole COVID assistance program. They were managing refugee supply chains. They were providing basic services to the population. They were setting up hospitals. They were becoming a government in waiting. Again, Jelani is not my politics, okay? I'm not whitewashing for Jelani. I'm just saying, from their own point of view, you can see strategic thinking, very effective long-term planning. So you can kind of see what's going on here. And here we go. Major reforms or empty promises. That's just like a normal politician. He's becoming a politician. Now, let's talk about what their beliefs are. They are still Salafist, but I would say they're pragmatic Salafists, meaning they're pragmatic. They want to succeed, which means you can't piss everybody off. You have to make concessions here or there. This is why they broke with ISIS. ISIS never made compromises and would kill you if you ever disagreed. These guys were smart. But they're Salafist. They're a very conservative version of Islam. They are autocratic. In Idlib, there were a number of people who were independent-minded who they ended up disappearing and killing. Let me say, so extremely conservative, however, pragmatic and not forcing every like woman and man to fully conform to their views. They allowed certain rights for minority groups. Autocratic, but not viciously brutal, not a police state with big prisons, not like Assad regime, okay? And then lastly, they are very, I would say, pro-capitalist. They're really into markets and investments and things like this. One could almost argue they're kind of, we use the term neoliberal, meaning very free market oriented, because the Assad regime was quasi-socialist, so they're very opposed to that. So think about it, Salafist, autocratic, so pragmatic Salafists, pragmatic autocrats, and pragmatic capitalists. That's who they are, okay? All right, so what's the next slide? See where I am. Right, Salafi, I just wanted you to see that. Next slide. Okay, so we're kind of coming to the final part here. So apparently they've been planning the last 3 years looking for their moment to show their forces, but all the time hiding, all the time preventing the Syrian regime from understanding that they were preparing to launch, you know, their sort of attack on the regime. And I think the moment came when, because of the Israel-Gaza war, the involvement of Hezbollah, the Israelis were really ramping up attacks on the Syrian army and military units, but particularly Hezbollah. And also, I would say, the Assad regime themselves, I remember following this a little bit, the Iranians and the Russians were starting to say, you have to make some reforms. You actually have to allow for some new participation. You have to, you know, you're going to have to get these sanctions lifted that are on you. The Iranians and the Russians were actually demanding the Assad regime moderate a little bit because they were looking long-term instead of short-term. And Assad regime was just refusing. So Jolani and his crowd, or Ahmed al-Shara, as we came to know who he really was, the HTS, his organization, basically launched a raid out of the blue, and they took over. Let's see, next slide. And here's basically their battle plan. Was they came over. Aleppo is, you know, really important city, but had been completely destroyed by the regime. They took over Aleppo, and I remember thinking, like, are they going to keep going? Isn't this going to stop? Aren't the Russians going to come in and the Iranians going to come in? They didn't come in. They let Assad go. It's very interesting to think about. And then they just kept going down the highway, down to Hama and Homs. These are the hotbeds of the revolution. This is where the revolution started. And people were cheering them on and joining them. And then they get down to Damascus. They just took over. 12 days. The regime fell. It's pretty insane. 12 days. And basically took over. The Kurds are still in their areas. The Turks still have their own. The Turks were letting their own sort of ally rebel forces. Let's go one more slide here. They opened up this notorious brutal prison, Niva prison, and released over 150,000 prisoners. Imagine. And these are people like, some of them just utterly destroyed people, you know, have been there for decades. Next slide. And suddenly now, here's where we are. We have the entire country is under, most of the entire country is now under this new government. These areas in the dark red are still kind of like run by pro-Turkish allied Arab forces. And these areas over here still have the Kurdish SDF and the the sort of Rojava government, they call themselves, still in power. So this is the fragile situation we have right now. But in all these areas in red, this new Syrian government is now in power. Next slide. And Ahmed al-Shara, remember? Young guy, went through Iraq, studied at Camp Bucca, now in power with the HTS. Okay, so let me just wrap up a couple points and then I'd be happy to take any questions. So where are we now? So we have a transitional government. Shara and HTS has said 4 to 5 years before we have an election. Could be a problem. Also might not be a problem because he's been calling for a constitutional Congress to rewrite a new constitution, an all-Syrian Congress. I think we have every reason to be skeptical of Shara. At the same time, hopefully I've established at least the case that you can see whatever he does, it's not like he hasn't thought about what he's doing, and he understands the context that the whole world is watching. So whatever their end-up game plan is, it's not going to be simplistic. So we have a transitional regime. The idea is to get a new constitution in 2 to 3 years and then follow that with elections. That's what they're telling us. They are reaching out to other groups. I think the main group that's going to be a problem are the Kurdish groups, because the Turks are going to expect some payback. And the Erdogan regime believes any form of Kurdish independence or autonomy is a threat to Turkey, because he believes that then the Kurds of Turkey, who are much larger, will start wanting their own autonomy or independence. So he wants to crush that Syrian Kurdish autonomy, remember, up in the northeast. And I think he's going to be pushing Shara and the HTS and the new government really hard in that direction. But here's, I think, my main thesis, is that the future of Syria, go to your next slide. I'm not sure what, yes, it's here. I know a lot of us care about democracy and constitutions and so on. Trust me, I do, especially right now. But I would actually make the argument that what Syria really needs is to be rebuilt. It needs a reconstruction. It needs a massive infusion of money and investment, and it needs an ability to unleash. Imagine all those Syrian refugees I was talking about. Many of them now have developed businesses. Now, some of them are in really difficult situations, but many of them have developed connections to international business, trade, finance, etc. Syrians are extremely resourceful, and it's time to start rebuilding the country. I guess what I'm trying to argue here is that if I would argue if democracy, or at least, let me put it more the way I feel, freedom for Syrians, however they're going to define it, that's actually what I back. If that's going to have a chance, they have to have running water. They have to have infrastructure. They're going to have the chance to start building their society again. I think that comes actually before the politics. I'm going to make that argument. If you want to challenge me, it's fine. This is how I'm thinking right now, how we should be thinking. And in some ways, I think the new government, I think they're thinking the same way as well, although they may be thinking, let's rebuild it and then let's keep our, remember how I defined their interests? A little more autocratic, Salafist, and pro-capitalist. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, that last part. And maybe they think they will be the new rulers and it's going to be a kind of soft autocracy, authoritarian. Forget it. I think the only chance that actually the Syrian people are going to have to really create a free society for themselves is if they get that economic development. What's the problem here? The problem, I think, is threefold. On the one hand, it's the Turks, because I think they're going to want to make Syria their captive market. The Turks also want a defense treaty with Syria. They want to have their bases in Syria. They also want to repatriate those 3 million Syrians pretty quickly. I'm a little concerned about that. The second obstacle to Syrian rebuilding and reconstruction is American sanctions. And I think this should be an issue that we start thinking about and talking about. The sanctions are on the Assad regime, and one could understand their rationale at the time, but that regime is gone now. So what do you want to hold on to? Maybe if you want a lever, maybe that lever, I would argue the lever shouldn't be economic assistance. These sanctions regime, for example, prevent the United States or any people it has financial relationships with from purchasing Syrian goods. Do you see, it's kind of like the Cuba embargo, right? It's a third-party embargo. It also prevents finance from coming into Syria from United States-related banking, which is huge. So it's really serious. The American sanctions regime was really serious on Syria. And again, when Assad regime is there, you know, actually, I felt like it was hurting the population more than the Assad regime, honestly. But nevertheless, it had a rationale. I don't think it has a rationale anymore. But if the US wants to hold any kind of lever, it could be recognition. Do you see what I'm saying? Not recognizing the government until it has a constitution and an election. Play that card. That's a big card. But I think, from my perspective, again, I'm just sharing you my perspective, I really think the economic development has to go first. And I think the last part here will be other outside actors, will be like the Saudis and UAE. If they're going to invest and rebuild in Syria, they're going to want a number of things. And what they want is, they don't want a democratic country in Syria, I'll tell you that much. They also don't want one that has a more liberal version of Islam, which is actually the default for most of Syria. Their standard practice is a very civic version of Islam, like you would see in Morocco or some of these other countries in the region. They would want their more Salafist, Wahhabi version promoted. And so I think if the US is going to play any role, I would say it'd be thinking about economic sanctions. It would be thinking about preventing external interference in Syria. And then I guess that comes to the reality point here. Last slide. Yeah, there's Erdogan, right? Do you see he's got a map of the Kurdish areas? That's his target. So this is going to be an issue coming up. Next slide. Right. That's not true, by the way. This is a kind of a fake thing that I found. But that's like the dream. Would be, you can imagine the Saudis and UAE, China, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is going to be a big question, is who is really going to step in and fund the development of the future Syria, I think is going to be a big part of this story. I think as much as we can help enable Syrian development, I think this is going to be a big issue for them coming up. So the Trump administration, I think I have one last slide. Yeah, look at that. He even turned on his buddy. I'm joking, but Trump administration, it feels like they're going to defer to the Saudis and the UAE. They don't really like Erdogan. They don't fully trust him. But I think they want the Saudis to get in there and UAE to get in there. That's my sense. That's who I think they want to lead in the Middle East, because the Trump administration wants to pull out. I mean, they're really not that interested in the Middle East. They want to go elsewhere. So it's going to be interesting to see what he does, but I think that's what they'll do. Are they going to pull the US troops out of the Kurdish areas? I think it depends on which side of the bed Trump wakes up some morning. And I don't even actually mean that as a joke, because he's been saying both things. He's been saying they'll stay, no, I'll take them out. So it's unclear, right? So that's going to play a role there. Are they going to end the sanctions? Well, if you talk to if you read from some of the Trump advisors, you see, this is the kind of the bus that Trump is assembling here. They're not all on the same page, right? He has some, I'm trying to be analytical here. So, but like, let's say like the MAGA team, they want to pull out of the world, right? So they don't want more. But then you have former neoconservatives like Marco Rubio. He's not part of the MAGA team, although he seems to be increasingly. But they want to keep US pressure in northern Syria. So do you see what I'm saying? There's actually a number of different voices there. So it's going to be hard to tell which way they're going to go. But are they going to get rid of the sanctions? I guess he has this one advisor. I'm sorry, this guy is he's not the best. Sebastian Gorka. Have you ever seen this guy? Yeah, they didn't send their best with that guy. He's holding on to the idea that Jolani is still ISIS. And he's pushing that line hard. And I don't know if he's the last one who meets with Trump one day, maybe that will be the policy. I just don't know who's going to get in Trump's ear because, again, like I'm saying, there are many voices at the table. So, okay, I think that's it to wrap up. Is there any more slides? I think that's where I wanted to end up. Yeah, so anyway, that's the story so far. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent presentation, Steve, as always. I have a microphone. I will take it around the room, and people need to speak clearly into the microphone with your concise question. And then we also have, I think, 3 questions on the chat. Maybe if I do, then I'm going to have Bryn let me know what they are. Jim Lazar, you get the first question.
We roll the clock back 20 years to when Syria was a functioning country, Assad was in control. How independent or
Let's say before 2011.
Huh?
Before 2011? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. How independent was the Kurdish region, or how integrated into the Syrian economy was it? And what does that tell us about where they might be 3 or 5 years from now?
Oh, thanks for your question. Appreciate that. They've always had a little autonomy. They've always had a little autonomy because if you look at that region, we're talking right here. You have this area is what we call Kurdistan. This is one of the largest regions of a particular ethnic population that does not have its own state in the world. I think it's the largest, actually. There are Kurds in Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, and Syria, right? This whole area right there. And so they've always been aware that they're part of this broader community, and in a sense, they've been protective about their own status. So they kind of negotiated a kind of a deal with the central government in Syria. You allow us some political autonomy, and we'll allow you to govern our space, and we're not going to have any problems. Okay, so they were integrated economically. I'd say a little bit of autonomy politically, but not full at all. And kind of a informal deal was struck. And every now and then, and there's Syrian military bases up there, and some of them would serve in the military. That's what I would say before. And I think your question is, could it revert back to that, right? Yeah, possible. I think it's possible. Look, like I keep on saying, Jelani and his crew are pretty smart and savvy. I can't imagine that they want to have a war with the Kurdish SDF right now. Those guys are really good fighters. It would be tough. Or to allow the Turks to just go wild on them.
Said those guys.
Men and women. Men and women. Yeah, I use guys in the Northwest way. Yeah. Men and women. So, yeah. Anyway, no, it's a good question. It's for us to think about. I think they're going to demand that the Kurds take down their autonomous government structures. I think that'll be it. And then it may go back a little bit closer to what you're suggesting, to kind of an informal autonomy, but not a formal autonomy. Anyway, we'll see.
Got a question over here.
Yeah.
What are the Russians doing with their bases, and how big and how
Okay.
much military do
That's
they
a good
have?
question. Okay, the latest I saw, and you guys could look this up after the meeting or right now, and correct me, but I actually think the Russians are negotiating with Shara and the HTS now to keep the Latakia base or the Tartus naval base, or at least some big parts of it. And I think they're willing to pay good money for this. And we know what the story is, right? Syria needs investment. Syria needs money. They need to rebuild. The new government needs rebuilding for it to have legitimacy if it wants to rule. And I would also argue rebuilding is good for Syrians to be able to free themselves from whatever. So I think they're open to cutting a deal with the Russians. We'll see, but I think it's about a military base. I think it's about the naval base, not air bases. So, and it shows you maybe Putin was smart this way of letting Assad fall, knowing that he was going to fall eventually. So I might as well not have backed him to the end, so that whatever new government comes into Syria is not going to be holding me accountable. You see what I'm saying? So I think that's what's going on. If someone sees something new, but that's what I saw recently was in negotiations of keeping some part of the military bases. Yeah. Go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit more to the what you see as the role either of the EU or EU member states with respect to Syria going forward? Are
Yeah.
they involved with sanctions?
Yeah.
What about the refugees? Those kinds of
Right.
elements?
No, thank you. Good. I think you nailed it. I think the big question will be how soon they end their sanctions regime. And frankly, Europe has every incentive to do so because they have shown us they don't want any more refugee crisis coming out of Syria and the Middle East, right? And they would like to repatriate or have encouraged voluntary repatriation of some of the migrants in their countries right now. So I think for good or for bad, I'm just being analytical. The EU has every incentive to take the lead on reducing sanctions. The problem is that when the United States puts sanctions on a country, especially financial sanctions, we still control the world's financial system to a great extent, right? In terms of banking activity and so on and so forth, right? I'm blanking on the name for that, but it's there's a name for this. But anyway, the U.S. still matters significantly in the story. So that would be the first part I would say. I'd have to look more closely, and maybe you guys should look at this afterwards to see who's taking moves on this. I'm not up to the latest on that right here. The second question you had was what?
No, that was that was the two part. The
Yeah.
sanctions and the
refugees. Yeah. So I think this. I think if well, I have to be honest with you, repatriating a number of these refugees just does not make financial sense for EU. But anyway, I hate to beat the old horse, but the industrialized countries of the world desperately need they need young populations. They need working populations. You know, they're on the other side of the social reproduction curve. It doesn't, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you're not open to pretty serious levels of migration these days if you're in the industrialized North. And that includes this country. Okay. But leave that aside. That's just a basic kind of factual thing. I do think if you see some of these populist right-wing governments coming into power, they're going to go straight to repatriation. They're going to go straight to sending it back. And the thing is that the international system is based on this concept of, for refugees called, it's a French term, non-refoulement. I don't know if you are familiar with that term. You can't refoul, meaning you can't return unless someone has a guarantee of safety. It's still not safe to go back. It's still not safe. There's no infrastructure. It's been destroyed. I think there's been about 700 to 800,000 Syrians have come back from Lebanon and Turkey so far, but these are people who are really close on the borders. And that might be capacity because of the destroyed infrastructure. So I would have real human rights concerns about forced repatriation, whether it was Erdogan in Turkey or EU countries that were starting to do this. Nevertheless, there will be a number of Syrians who want to go back. I've been trying to follow some of those conversations, but anyway, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
I had a
Sure.
couple online
Yeah,
questions.
please.
Two about Israel, so I'm going to combine them. The first
Okay.
question is, what is the new regime's stance on Israel? The two countries have been mortal enemies since 1948. And then the next question from somebody else, tell us about Israel's seizure of the south part of Syria and why it matters.
First of all, regarding Israel right now, from Ahmed al-Shara and the HTS and the new government, they aren't saying a thing. They're not going, Israel's our enemy. We're taking, none at all. They're savvy. That's not a battle they want to fight right now, okay? Now, belief system may be deep, underlying. Everything we know about many of these folks, Israel is not their favorite country. Many of them, Syria has always been one of the leading champions of the Palestinian cause. So I would imagine, just to speak, you know, analytically, they would not be a country that would take any lead in cutting a treaty with Israel, recognizing Israel's right to exist, et cetera, unless there was a solution to the Palestinian issue, right? And this was definitely a centerpiece of the Assad regime. It was one of the ways that they were able to maintain some measure of legitimacy, even though they were a brutal dictatorship and a kleptocracy. But they were really strong on supporting Palestinian rights, even though they were repressing Palestinians inside Syria. I know some of these friends of mine. So in that sense, this new regime, I don't think they want to pick any fights with Israel, and I think for as long as we can imagine, there's no capacity. On the second question about the parts of, yeah, Israel, they're in an expansionist mood right now. I'm serious, you know, whether you're a supporter or not, I'm just saying. They took a big chunk of the Golan Heights in the last month, including the top of Mount Hermon. I have friends I have Syrian friends who have Israeli citizenship. They're Druze Syrians up in the Golan Heights in this town called Majdal Shams. And I've been up there to visit them, and they are Syrian. But they went to Hebrew University. Yeah. They have Israeli citizenship. And basically what Israel did was take over the rest of that section of the Golan Heights and control the mountaintop. This is a mountain you can ski on. In Arabic, they call it Jebel al-Sheikh. A sheikh is a wise man who has a big white beard, and they call it the mountain of the sheikh because it often has snow on it, and it's a ski resort up there. But it's also, from Mount Hermon, you can look into Beirut, you can look into Damascus. So you imagine just strategically, right? And they're also taking extra land. So, I mean, at some point, that could become a real bone of contention. But honestly, for most Syrians, they believe the entire Golan Heights is illegally annexed. And according to international law, it is. Israel just annexed it on its own unilaterally in 1981. But but right now, I don't see any contention. Israel's just too powerful and too willing to use its power right now. And this new government, they don't want any piece of that. And I think that would last for a long time, actually. If someone is very worried about Israel's security, which I can't understand any objective reason they would be at this point in time, there's nothing to worry about on that front. And plus, again, Syrians are going to be so consumed with just rebuilding this country. I mean, there's just no capacity. So, right.
Another question from this person here, raising his hand. And then there are a couple more online.
Person named Tom.
First, Steve, I want to say what a superb presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Superb presentation.
Appreciate
Makes
it.
me proud to be your colleague.
Oh, I appreciate that. Tom and I, he was one of the first faculty I met at our first retreat that I ever went to.
And we go on and on and on. My question is this: do you have any sense of China's interest in playing a role here?
You go back on the slide and keep going. Did you have another? One more.
Oh, that's it.
There we go. There we go.
Of China there.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. There we go. Gee. However, again, this is not a real slide. This is someone, I found it, and I thought this will illustrate the bonanza that could come for those with deep pockets who want to invest in Syria. Right now, I would say China's not a key player right now. They were just given, again, I don't want to play politics, but they were just given a big gift in Africa with the U.S. cutting USAID.
Right.
They have a giant market in Africa that they are jumping right in right now. Just saying, whether you agree with that or not, but it's what's happening. And they're also really scrambling to get into South and Central America right now as well, because they see what's happening, especially if there's going to be trade wars and tariff wars and so on. So in terms of Syria, it feels to me like China would be interested if more development gets started. And yeah, I'd have to think through this more, because in fact, if the sanctions stay on, that might give China interest, because China would not be bound by US sanctions, right? They wouldn't be bound by any of these, and they could play their debt swap diplomacy strategy, right? And it doesn't always work out well with the countries they trade with, but they are basically able to kind of say, we want to rent your land for a while, and some of your people, and we'll write off your debts. We'll bring our infrastructure and our workers in. This is kind of their model. And if Syria is not getting outside investment from the EU, and if the US is not removing its sanctions regime, maybe you could see China get involved, right? But honestly, I think it's going to be more Saudis and the UAE wanting to get in there and make sure that Syria becomes more their satellite, because they don't like Erdogan. This is something people don't understand, and I'm sorry just to digress a moment, but amongst more, let's say, more conservative Islamic political movements in the Middle East, there's a big divide between those who are Salafist or Wahhabi. That would be the Saudi version of Islam. That would be promoted that you see in the UAE and in deeply conservative religious circles, and the one taken up by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, although they're not the same. And the kind of modern Islamic politics, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. There's a big gap between them. Saudis hate the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is basically Erdogan, Turkey. It's you remember after the Arab Spring, the first government elected was a Muslim Brotherhood elected government, and you have others. I don't want to use moderate and radical here. It's just, I would call them modernist, and the other guys are traditional, extremely traditional. These guys are modernists. You see Erdogan, he's wearing a suit and tie. He doesn't have a big beard. But he prays, he's devout, he's filling Istanbul with mosques. Do you see what I'm getting at? So they want to modernize Islam and make the country more Islamic, but still be capitalist, be, modern in their sense, right? Well, the Salafists want to take you back in time. So, so I could see the Saudis and UAE wanting to prevent Erdogan from sort of making Syria into a kind of Muslim Brotherhood state. Because that's what happened in Egypt. Egypt, you had a Muslim Brotherhood government come in after Mubarak was gotten rid of, and then basically the Saudis and UAE and other people made sure that they paid a lot of money to the military and to the guy, the new dictator of Egypt, Sisi, to get rid of that. No success. So that's what I would say is that I think it's more those. I think they're going to have more of an interest, and they have really deep pockets. And I don't think China would be so involved. But that's only that's a hypothesis.
Steve,
Yeah.
I have one question myself, and then
Yes.
there's two quick ones online.
Right.
That'll cover ISIS and Kurds. I'm
Okay.
curious about this image right here.
Yeah.
This is called water.
Yeah. Right.
And what are they thinking? How are they going to,
Dreamland.
as you said, how are they going to develop the country with what water resources?
Yeah. Right. No, serious is absolutely true.
You can come
Syria
back.
is
You can,
very impacted by climate change already. There was a thesis going around that some people bought for a while saying that the Syrian civil war in part was caused by climate change, because what you saw was there was a drought season out in the rural areas that was driving people into the urban areas, and that's where the revolution happened. But I think the Syrian revolution was driven by a brutal regime that was corrupt and kleptocratic, and everybody knew it. But nevertheless, Syria is deeply impacted by a water crisis, no doubt. No, these are false visions. There's in the Middle East, they call it the kind of the Dubai aesthetic. If you've ever seen Dubai, the city of glass, and it's got all this stuff, and it's got ski resorts inside shopping malls, and this is Dubai aesthetic. That's just selling some nonsense.
well,
But really what I think would be is that, and this is going to be the challenge, is that what you may end up seeing is that some of the Syrians coming back with money will be building these, gated suburbs, right? If development doesn't happen to the extent that people can start living, practicing, having jobs and employment, and then fighting for their political rights, you could see a kind of two-tier society of the really rich Syrians coming back, creating their little bubbles that look like this, maybe on, in a gated community. Like if you ever went to Cairo right now, there's actually a suburb called Dreamland. And it actually has golf courses. I mean, water in Egypt is not there. and they have golf courses, they have swimming pools, yards are being watered. It's crazy. And that's Dubai aesthetic. That's the Gulf spreading its sort of aesthetic around. So yeah, no, I'm glad you saw that. It's a concern. And again, that's why I'm pushing. You can see where I'm pushing. I'm like, no, release the sanctions.
And we may
I just know
see,
so many Syrians that are so smart, technically savvy, entrepreneurial. I mean, these are the ones I met in Denmark that I was working with. They were in Norway, they were in Sweden. I spent almost a year in Denmark, and I was working. You could just see the talent. They're highly educated. I just rooting for them. I don't want to see these Gulfies come back and just create these gated communities and snag the water. Go.
well, maybe we'll have a speaker come and talk about environmental issues in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's a
That would
huge
be,
issue.
I think
Yeah.
that would be interesting. Two last quick
Yep,
questions.
last questions. Sure.
From online, the status of ISIS right now.
Yeah.
And aren't the Kurds willing to work with
3
the
slides.
new, aren't the Kurds willing to work with the new
Yeah.
Syrian government?
Yeah.
And what's the status of
Back one
ISIS? So
more.
2 questions.
Okay. So if you see here, I think this is fairly representative. This is about ISIS. There are some areas over here in the Euphrates Valley and in the desert that you might find some remnants of ISIS. They're there. Plus, there's a jail up here in the Kurdish area that has about 10 to 15,000 ISIS prisoners inside. It might even be more. I'm sorry. I think it's even more. And if the Kurds are forced to fight for their existence, what do you think they're going to do with that jail filled with ISIS fighters? I'm just saying, it's precarious. So yeah, there's some ISIS forces, but they're not significant players right now. And again, the way you defeat groups like ISIS is that you create a much more stronger counter society. You know, you create a strong society. That's how you defeat ISIS, because they win. They have a whole doctrine, and it's called management of savagery. I wrote an article. You could look it up sometime. I wrote an article about this doctrine, and the doctrine is we win if we can create horrible conditions where people desperately need strong, forceful rule. So we will blow up cities and towns. We will create mayhem so that people are actually happy when we come in and create a fierce, do you see the idea? It's called management of savagery. It's actually this jihadi strategic thinker that's a very popular one for the ISIS people. So what that suggests, though, is that the opposite, how you win against them, is you have broad-based development. You have people who have capacities and have work and have healthcare and things to take care of. So I'm just saying, I think that's a story with ISIS, but it's going to take a while. So they may take some moves to try and take advantage of this, but they're just not that strong in Syria right now. Okay, and then the other one was the Kurds. I think I was just saying that a moment ago. Like to the first question, actually, remember about that. What they want is they don't want this government to make a deal with Turkey to allow Turkey to come into the north and crush them. And I'm not saying Turkey could do that. They're going to fight back really hard, but Turkey's really powerful. And they don't want the new government to make a deal with Turkey to allow Turkey to kind of take them out. So I think they're going to be willing to compromise. The question will be how much autonomy can they get? Because they've been governing themselves now since 2012. They've been an independent actor governing themselves in really significant ways. But I have a feeling the majority of Syrians, they don't want to see a breakaway Kurdish state. I'm just saying, whether you agree with it or not. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure on this government to bring them back into the fold. But again, what will the deal be? I don't know.
To be continued.
That's right. To be continued.
To be continued. A round of applause and then 2 announcements. Proceed. Thank you. Thank you. As they say in the news, breaking news, breaking news. I did mention that we are going to have a speaker in March from the World Health Organization about chemicals, about the environment. Then Jane Stone just gave me her email. April 17th, there's going to be a speaker. Public International Law and Policy Group will look at Europe and Washington, D.C. regarding negotiations over Ukraine. So we're going to hear about Ukraine and the latest, and who knows what that will be, April 7th.